Welcome to My Financial Coach Live.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to My Financial Coach Live. Today, I have Ryan, one of our subject matter experts, in the studio, and we actually have him for a very special reason. What many of our listeners may know is that I was recently published in the American Association of Physician Leadership, and I wrote an article called Seven Things to Do Before You Hire a Financial Advisor slash planner. And the idea is that, hey, if I don't want to do it myself, how do I go about asking questions to find someone who can actually help me? And would it be awkward if that were the case? So, Ryan, why don't I have you introduce yourself, maybe a little bit of background on your firm, and then I'd love a chance to ask you these questions so that way people can know, hey, this is what the conversation would sound like.
Yeah, again, I'm Ryan Bennett, and I'm one of the managing partners with the Innovative Group, and we help clients in a wide variety of different ways concerning their financial needs and different aspects of their financial plan. But that's who I am and what we do.
All right. Well, Ryan, I think just initially, are you hesitant if a client were to bring you a list of questions beforehand and essentially say, hey, I'd like to interview you? How would that conversation go?
I think, on the contrary, it's actually a welcome breath of fresh air when somebody's done a little bit of homework on their own, and they know what they don't know and they know what they know. And I always appreciate the fact that somebody cares about those things. It's actually disappointing and quite frankly a little bit sad when I meet with a client who for years just assumed that who they were working with was doing the best possible job, and that there was kind of a commoditized industry, and the reality couldn't be further from the truth. So I think most advisors who are in this for the long haul are actually going to appreciate and welcome that opportunity to have these real conversations.
Good. And I appreciate that because I'm sure that for our listeners at home, many of them have figured out that their financial advisor is a very likable person. But other than being likable, hey, what else are they? What should I be asking them? And I hope that it would be all right if I were to actually ask these questions to you directly and get your honest response. And some of these answers, I want to make sure that whatever it is, we're able to let our listeners know, hey, this is what it sounds like.
Absolutely.
All right. So, all right, first question. How are you compensated, Ryan?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because I usually tell people that there's really only two or three different ways that most advisors are compensated. Although I saw that in your article you came up with 5 different ways. But I typically explain to them that there are commission-based products where people are going to get an upfront piece of the pie, and then there are fee structures, and those fee structures can either be based on the way that, or the amount of investments that somebody's managing for a client, or just a flat fee. And so I'm in that middle group predominantly, where our firm, we take on a certain number of assets that a client has in various accounts, and we help them with managing those funds and in reaching the goals that they have for that money. So we charge that percentage fee.
So, you're telling me that most advisors get paid and they just don't like the people they work with and it's all free?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the circumstances, but I think most advisors are trying to work toward. I think years ago there was a disconnect between the way that an advisor got paid and then the actual work that they were doing, and it seems to me that the spirit of both regulators as well as professionals in the industry, we want to draw a tighter connection between those two things, and I think clients, whether they realize it or not, internally sense that. So I can't tell you how many times I meet with somebody who feels like they're paying the advisor that they were working with for no reason. And so I think that's ultimately the goal, is to figure out a way to, as I like to put it, pay for ourselves, and add more value than what it is that we might be subtracting from the equation.
Gotcha. All right, second question. Now, let's say you're a great guy, but maybe your firm wants you to do stuff. So does your firm actually require you to meet any minimum production or asset gathering minimums, knowing that, hey, if you're not making me money, you got to leave and make room for someone who does?
Yeah, fortunately, no, not personally, but that's another great question because I think unbeknownst to most clients, even some of the most well-known and big name firms, which I'm not going to name any names, but I think most people would be surprised to learn about really what's going on underneath the covers or behind the scenes, sometimes even things that aren't required to be disclosed. We tend to like to educate clients on what it means to be truly independent, which is the type of firm that we've built, where we have no connection to any banks, to any products, to any sort of strings attached to the recommendations that we're going to make or the investment decisions or advice that we might provide. And that's really should be the only way to go. But reality is a lot of the industry's very much connected and interconnected, and so that can be unavoidable for a lot of advisors depending on where they're at and who they're involved with.
All right. So what licenses and registrations or anything along those lines do you personally hold?
So I personally started out in this industry as a part-time life insurance. I'll just call it a salesman. I didn't realize I was a life insurance salesman at the time. I thought I was getting into financial planning right out of the gate, but really the firm I'd started out with was offering me a way to kind of get into this industry backwards, I guess you could say, because I was an engineer by original education, and so I started with my life and health insurance license, and then very quickly I realized if I actually wanted to help a client more holistically and really actually provide unbiased advice, I needed to go find another credential or another license. And so I went out and I got myself the Series 65 license, which is a license that permits me to provide financial planning services. It holds me to a fiduciary standard, which is something I'm sure we'll get to here in one of your questions, but is also very important. And it also allows me to provide investment advice and charge a fee, as we talked about in the previous question, for those services.
So that is a very good answer. I absolutely glad that you're able to give a little bit more breadth to that. Now, because of how your business is structured, then are you a fiduciary when you are working with your clients then in all transactions or just in some transactions because of that?
I'm glad you're hitting on an important point. I specifically didn't mention certain licenses when you asked the previous question, because if I had certain licenses in addition to the Series 65, for example, the Series 7 license or the Series 6 and 63 licenses, I would actually have what's called a conflict of interest. And that conflict of interest, up until really the last few years, was not something that was being very transparently disclosed. And that would actually cause me to have both a fiduciary and then a non-fiduciary relationship, or in other words, a broker or commission-based relationship, because I've separated myself from that and relinquished, even though I worked really hard to pass those exams and get those credentials at one point in time. It was clear to me that to really be able to earnestly, it's one thing to say that I have a desire to act as a fiduciary. It's quite another thing to say I'm exclusively held to a fiduciary standard. And so for that reason, in all transactions that I'm working with my client, I'm held to that standard, because the only license that I have that's regulated by any governing authority is the Series 65 license, which has a fiduciary standard.
All right, excellent. And just for our listeners at home, one thing to note is fiduciary is a legal term. It just means that you can sue them. So very important to distinguish. It doesn't mean that they're a nice person.
Yeah.
Which actually goes into something. So, ultimately everyone does things and there are consequences. So looking at our industry, we have what is known as a U4 in investment advisory land, but there are other, similar sorts of reports that are pulled up. Just think of a small business. They have plenty of Better Business Bureau complaints against them, or nowadays with Yelp, you can put a Yelp review on a business you don't like. So have you ever had any quote unquote Yelp reviews or, U4 issues? And what does that look like?
It's interesting because before I got into the financial industry, I think I mentioned I was an engineer. I worked for a large telecommunications company, and I can't tell you how often, if it came up that I worked for that company, the first thing I'd hear from somebody that heard about that, whether it's a friend or one of my kids, soccer buddies' parents, I'd get complaints about all the bad things that the company had done. And I'd look at them and I'd think, do you really think that I purposely had anything to do with that? And it's funny how, I think in this culture, we're very much a victim of the reviews that we can find, whether it's the star rating on Amazon or the Yelp reviews or for a restaurant or whatever. I think we've become accustomed to really kind of judging a book by its cover. And so I'm very sensitive to that because, as I mentioned, I relinquished a couple of licenses in the recent past. And in doing so, I had to uncouple myself or detach myself from another firm. And that was a little bit of a messy divorce, I guess you could call it. And unfortunately, the firm that you work for or attach those licenses through holds a lot of power when it comes to removing yourself or extricating yourself from that relationship. And there's a lot of financial implications of moving on. And obviously those companies are not thrilled to be impacted financially. And so as a result, we had some parting of ways that wasn't exactly how I would have scripted it. And so they filed some information on my U4, and it's there for the public to see. And fortunately there's a legal process that anybody that's dealing with that sort of thing can go through, and it's a very long and drawn out one. It's been multiple years now that we've been going back and forth with FINRA, which is the regulatory body, and then the attorneys that I'm working with. And ironically, it's probably more expensive for me to pay a law firm to work to clean this up than any cost to my business, because of the nature of, nothing that's on my U4 has anything to do with clients being, financially impacted or anything like that. It was all internal policy things that they cited. But long story short, my U4 will, when pulled up, will reflect that there were a number of internal concerns that the company came up with, again, literally at termination, never along the way, the multiple years I worked with them. And so that's what you'll find with just about any advisor. You can look them up on Broker Check and see their U4. And I think the main thing I would want listeners of a program like this or readers of an article like this to understand is that there's usually a story behind that, and the degree of transparency that an advisor is willing to provide is really the more important thing to take away. Obviously, if they did something illegal or really concerning, that's another story. But if it's something where there's just more detail than what could be presented or what was chosen to be presented by the firm that might have documented it, it's important to have that conversation and really decide for yourself. Just like if you have kids and you confront your child about maybe a mistake they made at school or a lie, you catch them in a lie, as most kids learn that the hard way. It's really, what do you do after you get knocked down, and how do you present yourself, and how transparent and genuine can you be about that?
Absolutely. And, for our listeners at home, in the article, I did note that any major issues, chances are you would see that their registrations and licenses have been suspended. So going into the final stretch, looking at your practice, do you provide comprehensive financial planning, or do you provide elements of comprehensive financial planning?
Sure, that's a great question too. I like to tell people that we lead with planning, which really requires us to be comprehensive in the way we approach. I think some financial professionals might say they do planning, but that's not what you hear them talking about when you first sit down with them. If you can usually tell in the first 5 minutes of either a sales pitch or just a conversation or going to their website, if you're hearing all about different strategies and returns and tax benefits, they're probably not looking as much at comprehensive planning as they are presenting a particular solution or strategy. And while there's nothing wrong with people that are really specialized and great at performing those tasks, I think that's one of the great things about my financial coach is, you guys kind of bring the best of both worlds to the table in both comprehensive financial planning as well as those specialized services. We also endeavor, I think that's why we work together so well, is we believe in comprehensive financial planning. And I think it would be almost disingenuous if we were in support of that when working with your clients but then otherwise maybe not. And so instead, through and through, that's a major focus and staple of what we do with our clients.
And for listeners at home, the difference between comprehensive financial planning and elements of financial planning is when you go comprehensive, you're going not just to solve one specific issue, such as your retirement or insurances, but you are looking at everything from your liabilities to your cash flow to your assets. And even though you may not have an opportunity to offer services around that, you are still advising on those items and how you can make better financial decisions. So thank you, Ryan, for giving us a very honest and open, transparent view as to how an advisor may answer all these questions. And I think it's very good for our listeners at home to think through, hey, do I want to have and do I feel comfortable having this open and transparent conversation with my existing advisors? And if the answer is no, then that should be of concern to you, because ultimately you want to have an open dialogue with the person that's, for better or worse, holding your financial life in their hands and holding your hand along the way. So for the do-it-yourselfers, continue being awesome and doing your research and handling your finances. But for everyone who is a do-it-for-me person, consider creating your own list of questions, whether it is for an investment advisor, a CPA, or an insurance agent, especially as that is something that you would like to get better at. And for those that would like a copy and is not a member of the American Association of Physician Leaders, please feel free to email us at customerservice@myfinancialcoach.com, and we are happy to get you a copy of the article that we referenced today so that you can formulate your own questions.